Hey YouTube, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher, and welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. Alright, today's video was chosen by our awesome patrons over at Patreon, and they kept with a theme that I had from last week, and that is staying on Alexander the Great. Now, last week I reacted to a video about Alexander the Great in Afghanistan, and this follows along that theme. Now, the channel is Alternate History Hub, and the title of the video is, What if Alexander the Great never died? So that is a very interesting question because he died at the peak of basically the conquests that he had just kind of finished up, conquering Persia, and had died at a young age back in Babylon. He was never able to actually rule this giant empire that he has now conquered. So yeah, there's a question of what would this empire have been like had he been alive to be able to actually run it? Because what ends up happening is the empire ends up getting broken up amongst his close generals. So he never directly got to rule over that. So the question would be, would he do things differently? I don't know. One thing I would possibly think as a hypothesis, maybe you'd see even more Hellenism happening, so more spreading of Greek culture into these regions. Maybe not, though, because there was plenty of that going on, but I'm interested to see what they say over here. Alternate History Hub's a great channel for alternate histories, kind of what ifs, and it's fun to talk about and debate about and see, based on what I know, and, as you watch, can see if it's, things that you would agree with. So we'll check this out in just a second. The original video link is down below. They do awesome stuff over there, so make sure you support the channel by giving it a view, like, subscribe. And if you like what we're doing over here and want to sub, love to have you around, hit that button down there, enable those notifications. Also some links to some other fun stuff down there. All right, with that, let's go ahead and get started.
Before we talk about Alexander the Great and Empire and changing the course of history, I wanted to say this video has been sponsored by the new strategy game Humankind. As any history nerd would be, I've been excited for this game ever since it was announced a few years ago, but coincidentally they offered to sponsor this video to promote the launch. To find out more, click the link in the description, but as for now, let's talk about a man who built an empire of his very own.
I love that. The Humankind game just recently came out, and I've played it once or twice, and very cool. Very, it's very kind of like Civilization. You get to take these ancient civilizations, but then you get to play as different ones as the game goes on. That's pretty cool that they sponsored them. Love it when the cool video games out there really will sponsor people. That's awesome. History ones,
In the span of a decade, his empire had grown from a small peninsula to the entire known world, as far as anybody knew. Not once ever being defeated on the battlefield, his only weakness was the will of his own troops, tired and sick of campaigning for so long. After returning back to Babylon, the center of his new empire, and mourning the loss of his friend, Alexander died at the age of 32.
Yeah, so if you want some context, I don't know, again, what they're going to get to eventually with how things stopped or whatever, but check out the video I reacted to. You can go to its Invicta's video about Alexander in Afghanistan and the difficulties that his military had in Afghanistan, which put in a context that, many different groups have had difficulties in Afghanistan with conquest for various reasons, but definitely check that out. I think it gives you some good context as well. But yeah, the famous story of losing his friend that a lot of people think he was romantically involved with, and because he died within a few months, I think, after that, and could have been tied to it in some way with grief or whatever.
In his mind, believing that he was a demigod, that his own men had failed him, and that there was more of the world to explore and conquer, which is why it's always one of the great what-ifs in history. The question of what if Alexander the Great didn't die so young? It's relatively unclear on how that happened. He could have died from malaria or some other disease. He could have been poisoned by his own men after having them march across Asia for years. No matter what the cause, let's say in this alternate timeline, Alexander continues to live on.
Okay, cool. By the way, the whole demigod thing definitely would have been could have been created or just expanded in a way in his mind after his conquest of Egypt, where he became like Pharaoh after he conquered Egypt and from the Persians, and yeah, he became Pharaoh. And you got to remember, with Pharaoh, you're basically seen as part god. And I would think an egomaniac like that, if you tell him he's a god, he's one that's going to believe it. It seems like that would be the case. All right, so let's see what they think happens if Alexander lives and doesn't die at that young age.
I mean, he could probably still be ravaged by alcoholism, grief, and a deteriorating mental condition, but he happened to always defy the odds, and so he defies this. There were a few ideas on where he wanted to go after Babylon.
You want to go back to India?
In this alternate timeline, Alexander decides to follow through with a plan to invade Arabia, or at least the coastline of Arabia.
Okay.
This would be one small victory before then heading back home. I'm going to be honest. A lot of what you're going to hear is just a creative guess. I will, however, be basing this whole scenario on one concrete fact. Alexander the Great loved to conquer. So while the specifics of where he would go and what he tried to conquer are left to interpretation, Alexander would always continue on fighting.
That seems very logical. It's his troops that wanted to stop and, not go into India more. But yeah, a lot of ways I've heard that, he returns to Babylon, not as it's just like it's finished and he's going to live his life, but to regroup, and that's where he's going to be operating from now, but eventually go back, possibly back to India. But yeah, he can go in a lot of different directions.
That said, a leader is only as good as those that follow him, and much of his generals and army were not in a mood to continue the war. The Persians were defeated, most of the world that mattered was under their control, and all many wanted to do was go back home and enjoy their riches. Let's say enough time passes and enough enemies are determined to be around, then Alexander's military and generals could be up for another invasion. But where to? Already went east, can't really go further south. And Macedonia, despite controlling so much of the world, still had the savages on their doorstep. It's not the craziest thing to imagine that the homeland would need a buffer, or some other reason. I don't know, Alexander needs to convince everyone to go invade the barbarians, not me. There's some evidence that Alexander wanted to go west. Greece at this time already had multiple colonies across the Mediterranean Sea.
So, we'll set up, there's not the Rome that we think of quite yet. It's still materializing there. So yeah, I was wondering where they're going to get to the east versus west. My initial thoughts were that it would still be somewhere east, but yeah, I'm interested to see what they got here. Why west? West makes a lot of sense for the fact that it's near his homeland, right? He's from Macedon, up over here in northern Greece, and there's a lot of resources, territory. It would definitely make sense to go left.
So let's say we got everyone on board somehow, Alexander is in good shape, and there's a decent enough reason to go fight the Illyrians or anybody else. Off we go. While fighting in the mountains, especially in the Balkans, is always a risky move, Alexander's military had experience through mountainous terrain. The Illyrians are quickly stunted, and Alexander's army goes north until reaching the Danube. Going west, fighting Celts, Gauls, Rhaetians, and Veneti along the way.
Well, we know later on how difficult this stuff was for the Romans. Only had little success in this part of Eastern Europe.
So here's the main question. Who would win? A Greek phalanx or a Celtic horde? Luckily, we actually have a way to figure this out.
It's gotta be the
After
phalanx,
Alexander's death in our timeline, there was a series of invasions from the north by the Celts. The Celts spread fast. However, they were beat back by the Greeks after only a few years.
Celts did go all over.
Up north, never really to be seen again or fight against the Greeks. So Alexander, with some luck and strategy, would make good work of any opposing force that tries to resist. Going west into an open...
Crossing the Danube has always been difficult for groups to go through.
Italian peninsula. This would be so early in Italy's history that Latin is not a commonly spoken language at all. In fact, it's only in one specific region. The rest of the peninsula...
Yeah, it'd be a lot easier to take over than in a couple centuries when the Rome what we know or gonna know is gonna really develop. But yeah, it's if you're going to take the Italian Peninsula, it's now. It's not later.
Peninsula is a collection of cultures and languages
Go get the boot.
not yet
Yeah, go get the
influenced
Etruscans
by Rome.
and all that.
Southern Italy was also populated by Greeks. These various Italian cultures of the ancient world, including the Latins, are slowly assimilated and eventually lost to history, their language and culture forgotten. From here, I could imagine that Carthage would be next, and unlike Italy, Carthage's culture and civilization would continue to live on. From this, Carthage would be connected via a new
So they'd go after him, but they wouldn't succeed?
road from the city of Alexandria. Now keep in mind, we're assuming this whole time that he never loses a battle, nor finds himself with a large amount of casualties.
We don't have to assume
Perhaps
that, though.
driven by a need to reach at least some end of the world, Alexander and his army continue to push on, wishing to reach the Atlantic. So, cool.
Yeah, you could see a kind of like the Romans are going to have their showdown with Carthage, that the Greeks definitely would have too, because just like with the Romans, they were going to compete for, you know, the Mediterranean. They're both civilizations that want to dominate the Mediterranean, and yeah, so you probably would have a Punic Wars, right? But not between the Romans and the Carthaginians, but you know, Alexander's group, the Greeks, Macedonians, whatever multicultural group he would come at him with.
Alexander could have conquered more territory and also prevented the Roman Empire from existing. We get it, Cody.
Yeah, it looks like the Byzantine Empire, doesn't it? You know, like time of Justinian almost.
And also
Kind of makes sense.
The Roman Empire from existing. We get it, Cody. Well, you see, this whole territory conquering would not actually be the greatest change in our timeline. It's time we discuss royal lineage and the importance in pre-Enlightenment societies of divine rule.
Okay. Yep, he's going to achieve godlike status after Egypt and continue it, right?
Timeline following the death of Alexander, he was deified in Ptolemaic Egypt. This was a political action as well as a religious one, perpetuating Alexander's divinity while...
It's got to be more political. Come on. The Greeks didn't believe the deification of their temporal rulers.
Also coincidentally linking the royal family with the Greek/Egyptian pantheon to the people. The right of absolute monarchs to do whatever they wished.
That's Zoroastrianism.
Alexander said, at least, that he believed he was a demigod. For the sake of their own rule, the descendants of Alexander may prop up a cult to worship him, even generations after his death. In the West, the Mediterranean...
You think there's a naivety enough for that to happen? Outside of the Egyptians, at least? Where you've had a continuity of sort of demigod worship, as the whole nature of the pharaohs had been like that for millennia. But outside of the Egyptians? I mean, maybe by some fringe extremists, right?
Is only further solidified as a Greek pond, with Italy and Carthage assumingly under Macedonian control. The only interaction any barbarian tribe might have with a prominent civilization is through the Greeks, and never the Romans.
Right.
Without Latin, the writing system of Western Europe is instead based on the Greeks. No shock there.
That's fine.
But without such a blatant genocide
Nothing
of
wrong
the
with that.
Celtic people, we'd see a writing system that blends Celtic and Greek, forming a wide range of alternative writing systems we can't even imagine. Think
That'd be
about
cool,
how
though.
the Slavic people adopted writing from the Byzantines, taking their form of Greek and transforming it into what's known as Cyrillic today.
Yeah,
Without Rome,
Cyrillic's all wacky. It's cool looking, though.
The spread of Christianity, nor the adoption of any Middle Eastern religion.
Ooh, that's an interesting one. No Christianity, probably, right? Because no Roman Empire. I don't know. I mean, it comes within the Roman Empire through the Jewish community. You'd have to, try to think of what potentially the Greek policy towards religions would be, and what they would do specifically with the Jewish community. That's an interesting thought right there. We'll see if they come back to that a little bit more.
Theism is not the norm. Pagan pantheons of any region still remain. There is no Vatican, which seats itself in Rome.
Right.
There is no continuation of Rome, a
No Holy
title
Roman
that
Empire.
was coveted and respected throughout the Middle Ages, even after the empire itself fell. Instead, we're in an alternate world where the bedrock of Western civilization is one conqueror, and any ruler coming after him would just be like the generals of our own timeline and try to claim legitimacy through Alexander. I'd imagine his legacy and achievements may be worshipped in the same way as, say, the Emperor of Mankind from 40k, and his Son of God status being a militaristic alternative to Jesus.
Wait. Keep in mind, it's unknown how long a cult of Alexander would exist. For sure. Depends on longevity of the Greek civilization in West Europe. Yet if Europe remains to be polytheistic, it's likely Alexander would remain a deity across multiple pantheons. True. A strange religious mythical bedrock for the West instead of Rome. No democracy or even Roman Republic. Just Alexander, sorry. Democracy just dies. I mean, democracy in Greece had already died.
Yet I'm gonna be honest. This is still the best case scenario.
Is it kind of interesting because people love to go back to ancient Greece and specifically Athens to talk about origins of democracy, right? And the Greeks end up abandoning, or the Athenians end up abandoning that, and Greece as a whole ends up abandoning that after the Peloponnesian War, really. And it's the Romans that really solidified that idea. But that's kind of interesting. Yeah, it's like it needs the Romans for whatever influence we're trying to say democracy directly comes from. But it's not like it needed to happen in Greece for a democracy to exist. That there's nothing exclusive about what the Greeks were doing that made democracy exist in the future. It's not contingent upon Greek or Romans carrying on democracy. That could have developed anyways.
For the Great.
The good ending.
In a more realistic, alternate world where Alexander the Great had not died when he did, it's most likely that his keys to the kingdom, his generals, and his followers would have just been done with him if they didn't do away with him in our timeline already.
Why?
They wanted to retire rich and with their new spoils of war. The Persians were defeated, and that was the main thing that mattered.
It's true.
Alexander, over the years, had become increasingly
goal.
erratic and less Greek, dressing in Persian clothing, and even wishing
for
his own...
he ended up learning to speak Persian, married a Persian woman. That's what he wanted. He wanted an assimilation of these cultures.
Men to address him like a Persian god king, by which they outright refused.
Yeah.
If Alexander had the love of his military like he did when they first set off to Persia, then sure, his army could have conquered the Mediterranean. Yet by this point, after 13 years, with his closest friend dead and his mental state deteriorating, he was more of a liability than anything. Had Alexander not died in Babylon, he probably still would have led an invasion into Arabia. It probably would have been successful, and then he would have retired into Macedonia, simply maintaining the land that he had conquered, while also alienating his own guard by being such a weeb for the Persians. As you see, Alexander would have wished for Persian and Greek culture to blend in his new empire.
Yeah, he
and
wanted
whether
that.
or not that would have been a success, we'll never know. Had he been successful in
It was
his goals
successful. With him dying, it was still successful.
and continued to live on, this area of the world might have become far more unified and culturally linked without his generals ever taking over. Had Alexander lived just a little bit longer, there was a chance that his dynasty might have continued far after his death. But we will never know how Alexander IV would have ruled, as he was killed along with his mother in a purge of Alexander's heirs. Gee, thanks, generals.
Is that really such a short thing, though, that they would just revolt against him and take him out completely? Especially when they said that he'd basically be deified and worshipped as a god, and religion would start around him. Those seem like opposites.
But you know, even though Alexander's generals did divide the empire amongst themselves, and could never imagine mixing Greek and Persian cultures, or Greek with any culture for that matter, there is a way for you to be able to, right now. Like I said before, this video was sponsored by Humankind, a turn-based strategy game where you can build a civilization of your own, but here's the twist. Just like Alexander, you don't need to pick one single culture. There are over 60 plus historical cultures to pick and choose from.
By the way, if you like this game, come over to our Discord server, and I know there's some people that like to play this. Join up with the gaming section on the Discord server, link down below.
And as you transition from each stage of history, you can incorporate the ideas and cultures of other groups to blend and build a civilization
that's what's cool about that
entirely
game,
your own. Go from a Neolithic tribe of Greeks and incorporate the ideas of ancient Persia, maybe move into medieval Mayans, and then transition into the French of the modern period. Each culture and faction comes with historically accurate elements that evolve the gameplay. Test your skills as historical events shape your civilization, and see how each moral decision you make affects your people. 6 eras of human history, and you can mix and match through all of them. Like I said, I've been excited for this game for a while. But if you want to check it out or haven't gotten it already, click on the link in the description to become your own Alexander in Humankind. Now available on Steam, Epic Games Store, Xbox Game Pass, and wow, even Nvidia GeForce Now. Ironically, I've been wanting to play it this whole time, but I've been working on this video.
Turtle chips.
So now that I'm finished, I guess it's time to destroy my own video schedule.
The Egyptians colonized the moon. All right, let's talk about the video. All right, so what did you guys think of the timeline that Cody had created over here? The things I was kind of confused, I guess, a little bit of was, when thinking about was the whole, like, he would have been assassinated or whatever, like, within 3 years of his rule. I mean, if he had stayed put and not done all that extra conquering, it seems like that would be the opposite of what would happen. I think the most intriguing thing was, to me, was what potentially the future for two things would be, Christianity and democracy. And that's one I got to kind of flush out, because, again, I don't think necessarily democracy had to be exclusively related to the Greeks doing it and then the Romans doing it, because there's not really necessarily a direct connection there anyways. So that could, forms of democracy can come in a lot of ways, right? Look at the reason why Athens basically became a democracy, and you'll see why, what the conditions usually are when a democracy is created. But yeah, I think the Christianity question is really interesting, because you would have to go into what the religious policy would be in Greece, in this Greek Empire, I guess, specifically with the Jews, because that's what it kind of comes out with. But you can't separate the history of Christianity without the context of the Roman Empire either, and in this scenario there really isn't a Roman Empire. So that is a very interesting thing to think about, and love to hear what you think. So comment down below, what do you think of these different ideas? Do you agree with what's going on here? Do you have other hypotheses out there about what you think could happen if Alexander the Great had not died at such a young age? I'd love to hear it. All right, and with that, thanks for hanging out, and thanks for checking out the video. Definitely give it a thumbs up if you liked what we got there. Check out the Alexander video I did a week or two ago if you want to see more about what happened with him and his conquests. And with that, we'll see you next time. Bye.